Yeah, thanks. So um, today I wanted to tell you a little bit more about Prometheus and what Prometheus is and how to use that. And it's going to be a little more technical. I also plan to make a live demo, and that's interesting. I really love live demos because there are so many things that can go wrong, and usually something explodes, and it's fun. So that's what is my plan for today. Mm, and before I start, I probably would need to explain to a bunch of people what Prometheus is actually. So that's a very cool open source project that makes it possible to record some metrics from your application, view them later in a very nice UI tool through a web browser, of course, and then based on those metrics, we can define alerting and many different interesting things. So I'm going to share my screen, start my GCK instance and do some hacking. And whenever you feel like you have questions and stuff like that, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Let's start. So I'm going to share my screen, snooze notifications, and then I'm going to open my terminal and go to my GCK. So let's move that window a little bit to the right. And actually, I had to fix Prometheus just a couple of minutes ago because it was broken in GCK. So it's a simple fix. It was using actually a wrong host. And what does it actually mean that needs a host? So Prometheus is a very smart tool that is designed to be very performant and run in production environments with high load. And I will explain you in a moment how it actually works. But before, let's start my GCK instance, which is GDK in Docker. So this is the command I'm actually using to start my GCK. And I should be able to open GitLab. So it's going to probably take like 5 to 10 seconds to boot. Our Rails application is quite huge, so it takes a while for it to start. Prometheus. So I'm going to show you the Prometheus webpage, and it also contains a nice section called docs. Whenever you feel like you would like to read more about it, like that's the place to go. And then I'm also going to start my Rails console. So I'm going to log into a container running a web node. And that's where GitLab lives, and we can basically open the Rails console in a moment. So as you can see, GitLab is up and running. And now how Prometheus actually works. So Prometheus is a separate application running on a different server, in a different container or different virtual machine. It's going to iterate all the endpoints in its configuration and scrape some metrics. So what does it mean to scrape a metric? It means that an application like GitLab or a subcomponent exposes some metrics, and then Prometheus periodically, it's on a configured interval, is going to visit this endpoint, see what metrics are there. It's going to just copy them into its database, its memory, and keep these metrics and measurements there so that we can later do some operations on them. So in case of GitLab, the metrics endpoint is exactly here. And as you can see, we have a bunch of text-based metrics recorded here. So we do have a lot of them already, but during this live demo, I hope that we are going to add another one. So in the GCK or GDK, I'm not completely sure if this is something that works by default in GDK, but in GDK, I'm sure that you can also run Prometheus and open web UI for it. So in case of GCK, it's exposed on port 9090. And this is Prometheus UI that allows you to enter some expression, and the expressions are in the format of PromQL. So this is like SQL, but for Prometheus. And we can actually generate some graphs and get some raw data here based on the metrics that Prometheus scrapes from the GitLab itself. So actually in production, we also do have something like that. But because of obvious reasons, it's not going to be available for everyone because it might contain some sensitive data, but it's here out of the load balancer, or some kind of security configuration does not allow us to access that on GitLab.com, but it's also in this place. So, okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about what can we measure. There are a bunch of types of things that we can measure and how we can do that. Let's start from the most simple thing, which is a simple counter. So let me build a new counter for you. And in order to do that, I need to do some hacks. I need to open my Vim and see GitLab runtime class. Nope, it's not GitLab runtime. It's 7 Prometheus metrics. Okay, so that's the file. That's the file that defines a directory in which we actually store the metrics locally on the node. Right now in GCK, I'm running Puma, but I want to, instead of changing files, Ruby files, I want to open a Rails console and do some Ruby magic there. And because I want to create a metric in the Rails console, it needs to be saved into directory under which it can be exposed with this path, so that the Prometheus running here, like this is the UI component, of course there's some worker running in the background, so that the worker can actually access that stuff. So I'm going to open Rails console in a way that makes it possible to actually record metrics. And I need to set an environment variable. It needs to have the Puma endpoint. And this is a Rails console, right? So this is not a Puma environment, but we are going to trick the Rails console so that we can actually do some hacking. And yeah, so like these are deprecation messages, don't pay attention to them. So again, it takes a couple of seconds for GitLab to load, so we will need to wait. But in the meantime, let's close this and let me show you that we do have the metrics. So HTTP get localhost 300 metrics. As you can see, there are a lot of them here, but we want to create a new metric, and it's going to be called GitLab CI demo counter. As you can see, it's not there. Something like that does not exist yet. So let's create this counter. So it's in Ruby code, it's going to look like this: GitLab metrics counter name, GitLab CI demo counter, our demo counter, our CI demo counter. Okay, let's close that. So the metric is, the counter is defined, and the counter is very simple. We can just increment the counter, and there's nothing more we can do with the counter. So that's how counters behave. So let's increment the counter increment. As you can see, the counter value currently is 1. Let's increment it again. The value is 2, the value is 3, the value is 4. Okay, so let's see if this is actually here now. Okay, so it appears that the metric has appeared in the metrics endpoint, and it's very simple. It's defined by some annotations and a value, and we do have some information about what type of counter it is, and that is basically a counter and the value that has been recorded in the console. So in this case, we modified the counter in the console, but in the real application, we would have some Ruby code that would actually do the incrementation. Whenever something happens, for example, we can have a counter for the amount of pipelines created on GitHub.com. We can have a counter for some actions that the user did, and it got populated to the backend so that we can actually record the counter. And now let's actually see how it looks like in the Prometheus UI. So let's refresh. GitLab CI demo counter. Okay. So this is the last hour. Can we have last 10 minutes? Okay. Can you see the counter? So it appears that the value has gone from almost 0 to 4, and 4, I think that 4 is okay. So we actually incremented in between scraping, and that's very interesting because we recorded the value 2, then Prometheus connected to the metrics endpoint, scraped the number, and then we incremented it again twice, and the Prometheus noticed that because it scrapes the metrics endpoint and also records the time at which the observation has been made, right? So this is like this very simple counter, and it's going to only raise. So if we go to the counter and increment it 2 times again, I think that the scraping interval is around 15 seconds right now, so perhaps it has been recorded already. Nope, let's wait more seconds. Not yet. 15 seconds, so it's quite unusual that it's not here already. Perhaps it's 1 minute, I can't remember right now. But it should appear like in a moment, I hope. Otherwise something like it's not working. Is it 6 already? No, it's 4 still. There's the zoom. How can I make it smaller? Okay, this way. Or perhaps the problem. Oh, okay, so that was the problem. We had the time set explicitly until which we are actually going to show things. So interestingly, as you can see, we can also see that it has been incremented to 5. It means that we record the observation when we actually increment a metric, not when it's being scraped. And yeah, so in this case, it's going to go only up, but that's not really fun. So let's do something more with it. And let me show you some PromQL. So PromQL is quite complex, and because I'm not a Prometheus expert, I sometimes struggle with it a bit. But there is this interesting function in the PromQL called rate, and then we need to provide a vector, which is in this case 1 minute. So this actually shows the rate in which the counter is being incremented. And we take 1 minute, so that's our something, how to say that? Or perhaps instead of showing you that, I will actually write some code. So let's create a second metric, second counter, demo counter 2. Our demo counter 2. And let's write some Ruby code. So let's make 60 observations. Let's make 60 increments on the counter. And let increment the counter 2 times every second. So 2 times counter increment, and then let's sleep a second. Okay, okay, 2 times, so that's syntax. Okay, so who can tell me how many, what's going to be the value of that counter after we are done with this loop? This is a very simple question, so I don't believe that you don't know.
120 and something, 128?
120 probably, right? Because we are going through this loop 60 times, and in each loop we are going to increment the counter twice. So it's 120 is
Plus
the value
what was
of,
already before.
I created the second counter, right? So what we have done before is not like, doesn't matter because it's a different counter. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's simple. So we should already start seeing some data. GitLab, so refresh the page. GitLab CI demo counter 2. So the value currently is 20. Or perhaps we should wait. Okay, as you can see, it's okay. So it's been done. We sometimes need to wait for the scraping because Prometheus is connecting to the metrics endpoint on predefined interval. So it's 120. So as you can see, it is only going to rise, and that's like not something that we are interested in. We want to see the rate on which it's being incremented. So this is a very interesting function, and it's called rate. There's 1 minute. So we are taking the whole minute of observations, and we are going to calculate the rate in which the counter has been incremented during that time. So this is interesting because we were incrementing it for exactly that minute. And who is going to tell me what's the rate of the incrementing of this counter in the time span of this minute? This is also not super complex question, but a little more complex than the previous one.
I think it's going to be a linear.
But what's the value? What's the value of the incrementation rate?
2 per seconds?
2 per seconds. Yeah. So I think that's exactly it. So let's see if it actually works. As you can see, it appears that that's exactly this, right? So that's 2 per second, and like, you know, it depends exactly where the scraping has been done and what we are seeing here, but you can see the maximum rate of incrementing this counter is 2. So yeah, it works. So that's basically what the Prometheus counter is, and there is like a lot of different things we can do in the PromQL. We can have many different counters, and we can add labels to them. Then we can aggregate the counters. We can define alerts based on those values, and for example, alert CI channel on Slack when something seems suspicious. And now I wanted to tell you just a little bit more about histograms, which are way more complex than counters, but the idea of how it works is basically the same. But before I proceed, I guess that you might have questions about what I've told you so far. So please shoot.
Yeah, I have a question. So if you define the counter, if you reuse the same GitLab CI demo counter under a different type, let's say that is not a counter. Does it Prometheus recognize that it's a different type and you can still use the same name under different type, or just the name is unique for the metric?
That's a very good question, and I have no idea. So we can check it. We will
Okay.
see what's going to happen. So let's define something else with this a gauge. A gauge is a little different thing than a counter because the counter can only go up and the gauge can also go down, because a gauge is, just a value being observed at the moment that Prometheus does scraping. So it can, for example, be something that describes temperature in a room, temperature of a CPU core and stuff like that. So how to define a gauge? That's a good question. Perhaps it's something like that. I have never been using gauges, so this might not work, but let's see. Okay, so it's been created. How to increment the gauge? Observe, perhaps. Observe. Increment. So I would need to check. That is probably somewhere in our code. So we do have a bunch of gauges defined here. It does not to be something that's super popular.
I think you can use dot increment, dot decrement, and dot set.
Okay. So I see that there is set, but we also need to provide labels first. And because we don't have labels, this needs to be an empty hash. So it's going to be gauge set and 5, for example. So that's interesting. So it appears that the gauge is actually defined as a counter. So perhaps Ruby code base actually detected that something like this exists. And as you can see, it returns the counter we have defined previously instead of the gauge, because the description is different, right? So creating a new gauge actually returned the counter. So yeah, so probably the answer is it's not possible to use it that way. Does it explain this thing, Fabio?
Yeah. So the reason why I asked that question is kind of a concern on whether, if we want to add a new metric, and even in our testing, we might, I don't know, we might not initialize all our counters, gauge, and everything. So could it be that in our test, what you just did, like you created like a gauge sort of metric, and in the test works fine, but when the counter is initialized first, then the gauge, then will that break on production? I'm not sure, whether we have like a techniques like in GDK where it's safe to introduce a counter, and actually we can know immediately whether it's a duplicate or not, or it will conflict with something else.
So that's a good question. So I basically think that as long as you are reusing the type, so you are creating a new counter and it's still a counter, it might work. But in case like this, like it's clear that we would have an undefined method, right? Because we are creating a, how do we pronounce that in English?
I don't know. I think it's gauge. I'm not sure.
Gauge. Okay.
Yeah, gauge is how I would pronounce that.
Gauge. Okay, thank you very much. That's useful. So in that case, we want to fabricate a gauge, right? But it appears that the counter has been returned. So this is definitely an unexpected behavior. And in my opinion, it's actually a bug. Something like this should not happen. This method would probably need to raise an error, an exception. So this is something we could probably improve to make it more like, less error prone. But let's proceed to histograms, because histograms are way more interesting, because histograms allow you to measure duration of something, how it changes in time, and then you can actually get some really nice data from that. So I'm going to just create a histogram here to show you how it looks like in the metrics endpoint, and then we're going to go to our production instance of Prometheus, and I'm going to show you the histogram of pipeline creation duration that we have introduced like 2 weeks ago, I think. Okay, so yeah, let's create histogram, and we are going to use the pipeline creation duration histogram that we have added. So pipeline command, it's here, I think. So that's the histogram that we added. So let's basically add something very similar. So name, comment, labels, buckets. Histogram, GitLab, metrics, histogram, name, GitLab, CI, something, demo something, seconds, because we might use histogram, for example, to measure durations. Labels, then comment, our histogram, and then labels which are empty, and buckets. That's something really important. But let's add 1, 5, 10, 100, for example. And histogram observe. I think that these are the labels. Yeah. And then 2 seconds and 6 seconds and 20 seconds. Okay, so I think it should work. And now let's GitLab, what's the name of that thing? GitLab CI demo something. Demo control. Did I really forget? What's the name? GitLab CI demo something seconds. Demo something. So that's interesting. It's not here, so that's an interesting example of something that can GitHub. Okay, there is a typo. Okay. So so that's interesting. So let me explain it a little bit more. So of course it defines a histogram, and it defines all the buckets, histograms count, and histograms sum. So the count is obviously the amount of observations we have done, and we did 3. So the count is 3. The sum is the all the observations summed together, and we observed that in 20, 2 and 2, 6 and 20, which gives us 28. And then we have all these buckets. So our first observation was 2, and the bucket is going to tell us how many observations we have done with a value that is equal or lower to the bucket itself. So there were 0 observations with value 1, right? And the next bucket was 5. So we observed 2 and 6. So in 5, we should have 1 observation. And that's exactly this. Then we have next bucket is 10. And we observed 2, 6, and 20. So in the bucket 10, we have 2 observations. And that's true. And then we have bucket 100, and in the bucket 100 we observed 2, observed 6, and 20. So we have 3 observations in the bucket 100, and there's this additional bucket. So everything that goes above our bucket is going to be recorded in bucket plus infinity. And based on this data, Prometheus is going to visit the metrics endpoint, is going to scrape these things, and it will expose all this data that we have managed to collect in the Prometheus UI. And using actually histograms, it's much more difficult, but let's go to we can probably check the data that we added, but we won't see much because we would need to have many observations done in some longer period of time, just the second or two that in our case. So let's go to the production, and on the production we have Thanos, for example. Thanos is a Prometheus that is highly available, and we are also having the Prometheus, like normal Prometheus on the production. And this is this one, but it actually has a bug. Oh no, it works now. CI pipeline creation duration. So we are not going to use Thanos because sometimes there is a bug here that there are no values in this problem. So what can we do with the histogram? We can see the rate of observations with their values, and this is quite complex, but I will try to write this from memory, and if I fail, I'm going to go to documentation, which is like probably fine. So okay, so it's going to be zoom and rate. Let's do that differently. GitLab CI pipeline duration count. Zoom rate. And we will take 5 minutes vector and we'll divide that by zoom rate. This is non-trivial actually, so I'm definitely missing something here probably. It's possible that I was actually successful with this. So what we are seeing here, let's increase the time frame to 1 day. So it appears that according to this PromQL query, it appears that the average time that we can see on this graph is that creating a pipeline probably takes around 400 milliseconds, because this is in seconds. And we have some occasional spikes up to 1 second probably. But let me Google Docs, Prometheus, histogram. And let me check if that query is, yeah, so that query seems to be completely fine. So, but that's, that's an average, that's rate. It means that we are taking data from 5 minutes, and that's our vector, and we are calculating the average rate for that time frame. And it's actually likely that we're missing something here. So there is more interesting PromQL function, which is called histogram quantile, which allows us to calculate quantile. Let me try to guess how to write that. So it's going to be histogram quantile. Let's take a look at 0.99, and then we will need to have some bucket. And okay, so this is days one, and we are going to need rate, and we're going to close that, and we need to sum by buckets. If I'm not wrong, it should work, but I'm probably wrong. But let's see. Okay, so it looks like it worked. And we have some really interesting insights here. It appears that we do see occasional spikes of pipeline creation taking more than 18 seconds. And here we are having 10 seconds, we are having 13 seconds here and 12. And the values that we are seeing here are much different than what we saw in the case of average rate. And it means that 99% of requests in a given time took less than 18 seconds, for example, in this case, right? So this is how the percentile quantile thing works, and you can Google more later because I think I'm talking long enough about it. Yeah, so it's time for questions. I don't want to take more of your time right now. So yeah, I'm going to be happy to answer any questions you might have.
I have one. Just so that I'm maybe it's a stupid question, but I'm thinking of like how this is used currently. So we basically add any kind of data we find interesting, and Prometheus will basically take all of that data and remembers it, and then we query all the data we want together, and that gives us our whatever we're observing, right? So we can combine all of these different data together.
Yes.
Basically, okay.
Yes.
Then okay, cool. I just want to make sure I didn't misunderstand something. Thank you.
And what would be the next step from having this data in Prometheus to have something like in Grafana?
Oh, you're muted.
I think
Okay, I'm sorry. So we do have a project, and I think it's called Grafana Runbooks or something like that. And that's a project in the infrastructure, somewhere in the infrastructure group, where we can actually use JSON-net syntax to define how the Prometheus data got translated into a graph in Grafana.
Okay. So we'll be like just as long as we know what's the right syntax, from Grafana we can still reference the name of the metrics that we just created.
So it's more flexible because you need to know exact PromQL syntax and query that you want to put there. And of course, you can locally check if it looks like it should. Yeah. So this way you can, work on the graph as long as it actually looks correctly, because Prometheus is tricky. It's very tricky, but it's probably the best tool that exists right now that actually makes it possible to record such a huge amount of data that we, for example, generate in production, because of the scraping mechanism, and that basically we have, those smart buckets and counters that are very small amount of data compared to what you would have if you recorded all the observations somewhere, right? Okay, no more questions. So yeah, what's the next point in the agenda? I think it's yours, Fabio, probably, but I don't have the meeting agenda open, so I don't know.
Yeah, so I think that could be maybe part of the technical discussion. I thought it was just a one big agenda, but unless there's anything specifically about technical discussions, I'll keep this point for later.
So if I can just quickly go over the technical discussion meeting overall. So yeah, just more of an intro. Given that it's our first meeting, the thing I was talking about is
Hey, Cheryl. I think we're getting a robot voice. Is everyone else getting that too?
Yes.
Yeah.
It might be a Bluetooth battery or something like that. It's can't really hear you though.
How's this? Is this better?
Yep, it's great.
You might hear some screaming in the back, but get interrupted. I was just saying that I wanted to make this meeting. I just wanted to give a quick intro for this meeting, just because it was our first one together around talking about tech debt. The other thing I was going to mention was the thing I forgot to do was maybe make this meeting optional in future. So attendance is optional for folks. And just a couple things just to mention was the agenda is meant to be crowdsourced, and if we run out of topics, we could definitely go to our CI Tech Debt board if we wanted to. And I just wanted to call out the changes that Fabio made to the team handbook page around sort of what we're doing with tech debt, how we're applying labels. So that's a good read through if you haven't had a chance. So yeah, Fabio, you want to jump to your first point there, number 2?
Yep. So I just wanted to mention that very briefly, so that there is some kind of work I've been doing like on the spare time about refactoring CI minutes. So basically, so this is kind of just to make everybody aware that there is some change there that we noticed where the logic has been, raising some high-profile bugs a few times, especially when it's about resetting the minutes every month, and that has caused us to jump in the call and actually investigate these priority bugs. So after a few times I actually have done that, I realized there's a lot of anti-patterns there and logic scattered across different parts of the code base, that we start to take a stab at this part of the code base and say, let's take all the logic related to CI minutes and remove under CI, because currently it's like scattered around the namespace class and helpers. So we are moving slowly towards a central location for where all this logic is. I just want to point out very briefly that right now, because we are right in the middle of the refactoring and it takes a while to finish this refactoring, there might be cases where some of the logic is in the original place and some of the logic is in the new place. So this could be something, especially for the backend engineers, to keep an eye on. Okay, so I guess I continue with the next point. So we have basically an issue, which is actually number 2 in tech debt discussion. And this is an issue that Furkan has been doing a lot of work and investigation, and pulled in Camille, Gregors, and myself, and try to come up with some approach there to move on. But basically, there is some inconsistency with DAG jobs. So there's this issue I just put in the agenda because I think it's one of the technical debt items that are most pressing. And if we agree with that, or if we don't agree, I don't know, just to bring this up to discussion. But from a conversation we were having with Gregors and Camille, there can be different approaches to solve this problem. They might require to do different sort of proof of concepts and to see like how do we want this code to look like. I don't think it's marked as technical debt as a label, but I think it is, right? So Furkan or Gregors.
It is
I think that,
labeled as bug, so it doesn't have technical debt label, but maybe we should add it.
yeah, so yeah, it's technically a bug because there's inconsistency. I think the part of technical that is more the kind of inconsistency that we haven't realized over time, and by trying to fix this bug, we are actually adding some technical debt purposely. So that could be probably something we would like to but I think it could be something we want to tackle soon. I don't know if it's marked for 13.1, so this could be maybe one of the issues technical debt issue we want to do for the next milestone. Do we agree with that, or how can we proceed with it?
So in my opinion, the DAG processing is kind of part of the core CI/CD platform, because it's pipeline processing, pipeline statuses. This is something that needs to work because users depend on that, so that what they defined in the configuration behaves reasonably well and the pipeline is being processed. And in my opinion, it's important. And today, some of you probably saw that we added the CI/CD core platform label, and I think that issues and merge requests labeled with CI/CD core platform and technical debt are something that is especially important. Of course, we need to be mindful about scheduling them in a reasonable way, but yeah, I think that's actually something we should work on.
Okay, so this is something then we can schedule it. We might still need to be, so basically this feature is not ready to be developed, to be worked on. So it's still a generic issue, right? And so we might need to do some extra investigation. So we can consider this still in planning breakdown, and it's probably very big, has probably a very high weight, and needs to be broken down into actionable items.
Yes, we haven't even decided what should the expected behaviors be. So that's why it's not ready for development.
But that's the issue that we have scheduled weekly calls for, or bi-weekly, I can't remember, but I think that last time we managed to actually make some good progress. And we decided that every one of us, Fabio, Furkan, me, and Camilo, are going to contribute some test cases so that we could actually figure it out what's the intended behavior based on the preconditions and data that we are going to put into a test case.
Yeah. So is that correct to say that although we might not solve this issue by the end of the milestone, we want to be able to even branch off some research issues or something like that?
So what's going to be the outcome probably is that we are going to have a bunch of test cases and better understanding of how it should behave, right? So I think that it would actually mean that we are making good progress with that problem, because it's non-trivial one, probably one of the most complex aspects of pipeline processing we are struggling with at the moment.
Okay. Any more questions about that? So I guess Peyton is your next point.
Yeah, thanks. This is more of a win that we had this milestone. We ported over, Fred and I ported over all the old specs that were in Karma on the front end to Jest, and I believe every one of them now uses Vue test utils. So that makes our front end testing a lot more sound. We still need to go back through most of the tests and kind of use better practices because they were really out of date. So they're testing implementation details such as like computer properties and methods. So we need to get around to making those tests have a little bit better coverage by testing exactly what the user sees. But I'm happy about this one. I was very glad to get this done.
Yeah, and to add on that, there was a very interesting discussion, and I think it's ongoing. But there's a the different approach in testing, and like there are like we used to in the front end have like a lot of testing every single property in Vue instead of testing just the UI, and this has been an ongoing conversation. But moving things to Jest is the first step. Also removing a lot of unnecessary tests that are testing every single possible outcome, but not what the user is actually seeing, and that will clean the code a lot. So I think this is a pretty cool project.
Yeah, definitely. And you can go ahead and take the next point.
Yeah, and I see that Sarah is very happy. So basically, it's been an ongoing. Like we've been talking about moving the pipeline data to graphical or GraphQL. I never know which one people prefer to say. But it's probably going to be a big focus in Q2. And there's a lot of work to do. And from my understanding, there's a lot of work that will even come from the front end, even in terms of like Ruby and querying. So like there'll be collaboration with the backend for sure. And from what I understood, the idea was that we're going to start with the easiest to implement, just so that we could make some of the work ourselves and then remove kind of that load from the backend engineers as much as possible. But I mean, definitely we'll have to think on that as we go and we move along the second quarter.
So do I understand correctly that front-end team plans to actually do some Ruby coding to expose GraphQL endpoints? Because currently, as far as I remember, we do not use GraphQL at all in the pipelines endpoints.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah, that we would do some Ruby and try to expose some of them. I mean, I don't know if that's a good idea. That's what I heard. I think the idea was to remove some of the load from the backend, because since moving things to GraphQL is a priority for the front end, we might not be aligned on the priority, and that's a discussion we should definitely have. Like, if the backend has their own priority and the front end has different, like implementing GraphQL, we wouldn't want to ask the backend, like, you have to do this, otherwise we're blocked, and then shift your whole priorities. So I don't know what's your take on that.
So I think it's interesting. However, in my opinion, pipelines endpoint is one of the most complex we have in the entire code base, especially because of the amount of low-level coding that we've done here to make it more performant, to avoid, for example, N+1 GitLab requests and stuff like that. So it might be a challenge. I don't know if this is something that front-end team wouldn't be able to do. Yeah.
I think more along the lines what front end may be focusing on, I'm not 100% sure, but it's more of like the schema definition for like what we need from the front end and defining that. It may be too complex for front enders to, hop in and refactor, something to use GraphQL. Your CI backend will know more about that. But the thing is, we do plan to do it very in iterations. So like port, maybe one piece of the product or one feature of the product over, and then kind of go like that. So we don't just, refactor everything and have some bugs that we didn't expect.
Also, I think it's a really good opportunity for us all to work closer together. I think there's a lot of space for front end to do some stuff and get feedback and iterate that way, so that we can move towards it, and back end can I think we're all really excited to learn too. So I think it's like a good opportunity for us all to work together, and for front end to take some of the more tedious stuff without breaking queries. I'm excited about it. It's a dream.
I'll jump in a little bit on this too. I think, Sarah, maybe we talked about this week, but the idea that has sort of been, discussed is like having front end start down that path. And there's going to be some things for sure that are really complex and that we have to, that are just going to be harder pieces of data to get or whatever. But getting started down that path is going to at least make some progress. And then, maybe we get some of the fields in there that we need, and then others we'll have to, spin out a task for that or something. But we'll get farther by at least starting on it, and then figuring out where the challenges are as we go. So obviously we're not going to be just, merging code into master without getting some sanity checks and stuff like that. So it's a way to make progress. So
it might be a good idea to have an approach where whenever we want to implement something, we open the MR and we start by having a technical discussion with the front end and the back end. So the front end propose what they want to do, and then the back end approves or say oh, you're going to go down a rabbit hole because of this and that. And so we can have a very early conversation and then the front end can try and implement that specific point and then get it reviewed after.
I like that idea. Maybe we can have a label of something like "There be dragons" or something, so that people know. Be careful. It's dangerous here.
Yeah, front enders are trying to watch Ruby. Everybody watch out.
All right. Does anyone have anything else before we wrap up? No. Okay. All right. The last item on here is is our ROTI score. So go ahead and rate the meeting. Looks like we're doing this with emojis now. Is that my understanding?
I have one last question. So just to try to understand, like, so we pretty much like mentioned a couple of technical debts that we want to would like to get addressed. How do we get these issues, for example, in the next iteration? Like, do we need to apply a label there, and so we ensure we can schedule them, or does need to be like a discussion with product? I'm just trying to understand, like, if we have a list now, what do we do with that?
So that's a good question. Do you think these are ready to work on, or do they need to be weighted? Are they scoped?
So the one we discussed about DAG inconsistencies, these are not ready. They are not. So it's more like about discussion we are having.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we could have probably spawned there some small issues, maybe where we can at least dedicate time to actually work on it.
Mm-hmm.
But in case of DAG, we actually agreed that we are going to spend some time working on test cases, right? So does it mean that we should have an issue for each test case and any one of us going to add, or should we like do that in the meantime? So that's interesting.
No, I'm saying like whether. So is this like considered a sort of epic issue, and maybe we need to create like an issue to improve test cases, and so then we can close it and say for 13.0 we just closed and we solved the problem of the test cases, and then continue with the next steps, or we just use this issue as a sort of issue for 13.1.
That's interesting, because I think that the weight on this issue is actually very high. So perhaps we should right away promote it to an epic and create small issues for what we are actually intending to do in the next milestone.
I think that's a good idea. At a minimum, having an issue to start with that we can put on the milestone and kind of track the work is, I think, important. And so maybe if that issue is a brand new issue that we're going to create, let's go ahead and create that. Go ahead and put the 13.1 milestone on it, and then tag Cheryl and I and Tao and say this is an important technical debt issue for 13.1, and that will get kind of into the view for the planning, and then it's up to us to talk with product about it and make sure that we can sort of expect that will get put into the milestone. But I think that I think it should be fine. So, but we don't want 100 of those coming all in one milestone, because we'll have to figure out which ones we prioritize over others. But it seems like these are easy enough to talk through.
Great.
All right. Anything else? Cool. Happy Friday, everyone.
Happy Friday. Nice to see everyone. Bye.
Have a good weekend.